Welcome to the Curatorial Roundtable. I'm Stephen Henry Madoff, the chair of the MA Curatorial Practice Program at the School of Visual Arts in New York. And each week I invite an interesting, distinguished curator to come and talk about their practice from all over the world. And today I'm really happy to have Lucia Pietroiusti, who I'm going to read a short bio of. And what will happen is that Lucia will have about 50 minutes to do her presentation. And then at the bottom of your screen is the Q&A, and that's where you can write a question, make a comment for Lucia in the last 10 minutes. So Lucia is head of ecologies at Serpentine London. As a curator, programmer, and organizational strategist, she works at the intersection of art, ecology, and systems, often outside of the exhibition space. Ecologies at Serpentine is a holistic initiative and purpose-led department aimed at embedding environmental responsibility throughout the organization's infrastructure, operations, networks, and programming. Lucia was the founder of Serpentine's General Ecology Project and the curator of Sun and Sea at the Lithuanian Pavilion at the Venice Biennale in 2019, and then was on tour. Together with Filipa Ramos, she's the curator of Songs for the Changing Seasons, Personas Persons, and The Shape of a Circle in the Mind of a Fish. Lucia is also a curator of Sites of Practice, Back to Earth, and Infinite Ecologies Marathon. So with that, I'm going to read a passage that I just think is, as I was saying, Lucia, just before we began, it seems with what's happening in the US at the moment, a very, what should I say, prescient text between apocalypse and hope. And this is from a text that Lucia has written called All That Remains of the Changing Seasons. In it, she writes, "This, I wonder, may be what the end of a world feels like when it is happening in real time. A progressive loss of meaning, a drive towards acceleration and annihilation, an acceptance of unspeakable horror as though it were ordinary. We call it the polycrisis and speak of it as though it were separate from us, as though it weren't everywhere, including inside of ourselves. From this point of view, then, it may be appropriate to stop trying to articulate solutions too quickly and to start, in the first place, exercising our capacities to hold, bear witness to, remember, and navigate this great churning. What habits of mind, what stories, what rituals may help us hold and weather change? What embers do already we hold of what has been? How to make space for what we may never experience? What questions can we ask to a world that's ending? And here we come to one of the first glimpses of how we may be able to understand art, culture, stories, myths, songs, and its responsibility, agencies, and potentials. Because the space of a story or an artwork, or, when done responsibly, a cultural space, could be that where complexity, ambiguity, discomfort, fear, and denial can be held with tenderness without seeking immediate answers or resolutions. So with that, Lucia, welcome.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you so much. And I have to say that that was one of the most beautiful readings of a text that I've written in my life. And you'll have read it much, much, much more beautifully than I will, because I will actually quite purposefully, as I was listening to you, I decided that I will quite purposefully repeat that passage so that we may experience a proposition around ends of worlds and potentially beginnings of other worlds, both at the beginning of this entire trajectory that I'm going to that I have the privilege to be able to share with you, and towards the end. So as I was reflecting, and thank you for the invitation, thank you, Stephen, thanks to Ree as well. While I was reflecting on the invitation and the prompt to discuss some recent projects, I, doing the typical thing of reshuffling the projects around via the medium of Google Slides and trying to figure out what makes sense today, it occurred to me that the projects that I have set up or have joined or have been working on or am developing head in many different directions emotionally in the sense. And so I thought that what I would offer you is, in a way, sort of 25 minutes of optimism and 25 minutes of pessimism, even though I think that that's not actually very correctly the emotions that are accompanying this project, but on the surface of them, they might be read as such. Or another way of saying it is perhaps 25 minutes of, looking for responses, solutions. Solutions is a word I really don't like, but looking for ways of doing, and 25 minutes of looking for ways of staying with. So let's see. The first half is a story of a trajectory of projects, and I will probably just speak to you. And then the second is also a story, but in the shape of a kind of I mean, I think calling it a lecture performance is a bit much, but a sort of text accompanied by images, very connected and similar to the text that Stephen, you read, and that was published as only a text. But the images kind of give it something else. So I will do that and hopefully not run out of time. So what is ecological practice? This is a question that I ask myself all the time. In fact, it's sort of more or less the core question at the root of my job. And it's a question that I ask myself in relation to artistic practice and in relation also very importantly to institutional practice or the practice of cultural spaces, be they spaces of commissioning, producing, displaying, or teaching and learning art and culture making. I ask myself this question because under that question is this question: what is art and culture's role and agency in the face of environmental breakdown? There's probably more than one. And my instinct, after having been in this space for about 10 years, and I'll tell you a bit of the story of that trajectory, my instinct is that we are, as within the cultural space, we are actually incredibly good at doing the thing and not very good at advocating why it's important. So if we look at, the history of human marks on and with the planet and in kind of coevolution with the planet, art is there from the very, very beginning as a way of making sense. And yet we seem to limit ourselves in our imagination when we enter spaces of purpose and advocacy. We tend to speak very, very poignantly, but only about two main things I tend to find. On the one hand, the absolute need and drive to reduce the impact on the planet of the sector, clean up our act from an environmental sustainability and environmental justice and social justice perspective. On the other, this question of raising awareness, helping science express itself more poignantly, and so on. Now, I find, having just from practice, not from philosophy, but I find that whilst those two things are supreme importance, they fall short of describing the breadth of what art and culture actually are. And not only that, but the more ecology and the environment take an important and prominent space in the discourse of art and culture under those two banners, the more they tend to sort of take oxygen away from all the other stuff, the sort of messier, more difficult to discuss stuff that's in between. And I think there's a reason why I'm kind of interested in all of this, besides the fact that I've been working in an institution in various institutions for more than a decade. And therefore, I've decided to channel those infinite frustrations and exhaustions that come with working in an institution into a set of practical prompts and questions, such as how might a cultural institution need to transform in order to attend to the needs of the present moment. And another way of saying that is, how can a cultural institution sustain life? Now, I think that there's a kind of history to this. I didn't train as a curator. I'm absolutely ignorant still very much a learner and a student into the space that Stephen, because you're the only person I can see, but Stephen, that you steward. But I did emerge in a context in which I studied English and French literature, and then went on to study gender and women's studies, within which I wrote a thesis that had to do with mourning and grief as it connected to the emergence of queer theory. So through the AIDS crisis and through the work of certain artists that addressed questions of counter-monumentality and grief and what makes a mournable life. In fact, Judith Butler's Precarious Life was one of the most important books at the time. And then I moved on to critical and cultural theory after that. So there was a kind of soup of disciplines that formed me, but it basically meant that what I was interested in the most was not so much a particular specialism, but more the way in which you sense into synchronicities in the ways that different disciplines speak about the present moment or speak about fear, their fears or the future and so on. And I was always interested in listening out for those. Now I will get back to that because I think it's important to me, so I'm hoping it will be important to you. But I just wanted to start with this, which was just a few assumptions around environmental justice and balance, so that we can all sit in the same environmental space. When I speak about sort of ecology and the environment, I am, quite a bit of my time is taken up by questions around sort of impact measurements and sustainability and circular economies and things like this. But I think there's also some things and research at the root of that that's really important, and really important to state just at the outset. So the causes and effects of climate breakdown are, of course, unequally distributed. And that today's dispositions of space, whether it's infrastructure or the financial system or climate itself, is built on empires, infrastructures, plural. I'm in fact working on a project that will put the British East India Company on trial for current climate crimes, because so much of the sort of systems that govern the world today were set up to benefit empires corporation. Those dispositions are still active today, but they are more or less visible and more or less hidden. And then I would like for us all to be very much aware as we sit in this space that at this very, very moment, we're unlikely, just by virtue of connecting into a Zoom call and listening to me speak for 50 minutes, we're unlikely to be at the front line of climate breakdown ourselves, but that we all in the room hold connections and resonances to those and allyships and practical connections and family connections to those places. And so we arrive in this space with a very different experience of climate breakdown. And then lastly, that culture, myth, storytelling, and art have all a role to play, which is multifaceted and goes beyond what a friend of mine called the graphic designing of the catastrophe or making data beautiful principles. So on multidisciplinary, Amitav Ghosh describes this contemporary crisis of the imagination in The Great Derangement. I'm sure it's a book that's familiar to you, that's both in science and narrative, as one of the main obstacles to face environmental breakdown today. He identifies a trend that comes from the European Enlightenment and Empire, talking about discontinuities as a habit of mind, and quote, to break problems into smaller and smaller puzzles until a solution presented itself. This is a way of thinking that deliberately excludes things and forces or externalities that lie beyond the horizon of the matter at hand. It's a perspective that renders the interconnected of Gaia unthinkable. So it's a commonplace statement to make that the environmental breakdown that befalls the planet today, or this particular breakdown of today, is infinitely complex, unequally distributed, and occurring at scales that are challenging for us to grasp. And it would be a very hard sell to suggest that all of the various disciplines that have emerged as a result of, let's say, dominant epistemologies that are so focused on breaking the puzzle into smaller and smaller pieces should make an entire U-turn and become all Gaians. But do we sometimes, and I think we do, and all the conversations that I have, particularly with scientists, seem to point in that direction, do we mourn the distance between the smaller and smaller puzzle and the weave and the fabric of the everything? There are practices that, of course, put us in touch with the weave and the fabric of everything, but a lot of the times you find specialists feel like they're the sort of particular tile on which they stand is a very lonely place. And there's an enormous amount of, I suppose, entrusting of, so long as we follow the science, we're all going to be fine. Well, I can assure you, my sister's a climate scientist, and she always says to me, the IPCC report might show you a prediction or a simulation or a set of data based on a model for prediction or simulation, but that is actually an averaging out of models that come from laboratories the whole world over, and those models are so different and spit out such different data as to have a range that is largely saying almost nothing. So nobody's really actually driving the bus, and we're putting the onus of solving all the problems to the science and technology, and yet not allowing spaces in which those even those uncertainties and the spaces of the uncertain can be sort of shared. So I've kind of made it my business to, I guess, stand in spaces in which those uncertainties can be held, if only in the space between the disciplines and between modes of thinking and between positionalities. I was always very touched by this passage from Keller Easterling's Medium Design book, because it corresponds to my actual physical experience of the world. I have actually doesn't look like it, but incredibly thick glasses and very sort of non-normative vision. And I oftentimes, and also a kind of neurological condition to do with face recognition, but oftentimes that basically boils down to the fact that I tend to think that I know people when I don't, rather than the other way around. And that means I say hi to people. I've hugged strangers in the street. I've done all kinds of funny and embarrassing things, and also upsetting things, of course. And but I found that there was something to be gleaned from this question of hyper recognition rather than under recognition. A hyper recognition that perhaps comes when we don't hold the rigor of specialization and specialism as one of the primary kind of methodologies through which we navigate our role, but actually productively or in some way creatively or with the passion of a poet, try to bridge those gaps by blurring our vision purposefully in order to see connections. So Keller writes, where nothing is new and nothing is right, there are no dramatic manifestos, but maybe there is a chance to rehearse a habit of mind that has been eclipsed. You are already able to detect, as if with half-closed eyes, a world at a different focal length. Rather than only declarations, right answers, objects, and determinations, you can detect and manipulate the medium or matrix in which they are suspended and in which they change over time. So I'd invite you to think of all the projects that are coming after this as a sort of attempt, a cook's poor attempt to make soups that the medium and matrix of which is one in which things can meet, which are normally at a distance. Now, in 2018, I've always had an interest in systems thinking, and particularly in the legacy of ecological and cybernetic thinking, and actually more recently in the legacy of, in the meeting point of cybernetics thinking and the, let's say, psychedelics revolution of the 60s and 70s. I was also really interested in the idea of ecology as something a little bit vaster and wider than what we strictly understand as environmental ecology. And so in 2018, I proposed a project to Serpentine. I was curator of public programs at the time. This is important to say because I didn't much care about exhibitions quite yet. And even though, the most beautiful ones had changed my experience of the world really substantially. But I was kind of playing around in the field of discourse already. And the impulse emerged out of an event that we held in 2014, which was co-curated with Gustav Metzger and was an interdisciplinary gathering on the notion of extinction. And I remember going to my director at the time after that. It really sort of, the research was about a year, and it affected us all very profoundly. We all started to have very strange dreams. It was on the extinction of species, but also the extinctions of forms of knowing, and we had very strange dreams. And I remember going to my director, Hans-Ulrich Obrist, and saying, why don't we just do this yearly festival, the marathon, on the subject of extinction every year? We just stay stuck. A kind of flatlining of, if you want, thematic, sort of thematic creativity, assuming that extinction has a kind of final quality to it. So, you know, I can't remember exactly, but map, poetry were the themes of the previous years, gardens, transformation, blah, blah, blah. And then it would just go extinction, 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 extinction. Interestingly, that's exactly what happened to the practice of the Argentine artist Adrián Villarrojas, who in COVID started to title his works The End of Imagination. And every single work since COVID has been called The End of Imagination. So we had, and Adrián and I share quite a lot of references, at least, and quite a lot of conversations. And so I was really moved by that choice. So the General Ecology Project was written in the wake of all of this. Hans-Ulrich laughed and didn't think I was being serious, but then I kind of was. So 4 years later, I proposed a project to Serpentine, the aim of which would be to, quote, embed environmental thinking, environmental purpose, excuse me, within the infrastructure and the networks and the programming of the organization, starting from the point of agency that I had, so not trying to reinvent the wheels, but basically, I mean, it was very simple. It was take the budget of public programs, make it, now it is the budget of general ecology, and start to program things obsessively and compulsively, and with, you know, with some, figure out some connection to the exhibition program and to everything else that we were doing, but just obsessively program things that have to do with ecology and the environment over and over again. Now, what happens there is that the institution might not realize, and it did indeed operate on a very small budget and as quite the parasite at the time, but over the course of many, many programs, notably The Shape of a Circle in the Mind of a Fish with Felipe Ramos that Stephen, you mentioned, there started to be a community of audience that actually did come back and recognized the institution as one that was invested in this. The appointment, I say this because it sounds really good, but actually literally I just changed my job title from curator of public programs to curator of general ecology as a way of beginning to make a kind of flirtation with structural change. And that happened over the years, as I will eventually get to tell you. But long story short, what we did was a series of publications and collaborations and programs. The Shape of a Circle in the Mind of a Fish still goes on 6 years later, 7 even, and is coming up with a big publication soon, but it was focused on consciousness and intelligence across species and beings. So the way to also attract an interest in the ecological and the environmental was also to choose subject matters that were, you know, in some moments quite also seductive. So what happens is suddenly your audience keeps coming back and mirrors back at you, the audience and some of the, I guess, where it was picked up in the media, mirrors back at you an image of yourself as an institution that has something to say or something that it does in the environmental space. And then suddenly that puts the institution in a place of responsibility and accountability towards that. And that was a bit of a kind of turning point. This is a much more recent communal table event that we did on seeds and worlding and empire still at Serpentine. But just to show you that there's a kind of somatic breadth of programming that goes from book to bread. And here a commission of a tabletop role-playing game by David Blandy, in which you play different characters in a research station that's developing a monocultural sort of species to A monocultural, a monoculture of a species that is supposed to protect or be protected from, and you choose either a parasite or a certain kind of climatic condition and so on. But of course, this attempt at controlling quote unquote nature backfires completely. And by the end of the game, I mean, I'm not giving anything away, although I hope that you get the chance to play it. By the end of the game, the plant has taken over the bodies of some of the researchers, and essentially the game ends with the plant revolting. So the reason why I mentioned this project particularly, and it's very, very recent, is because after being play tested within the organization of Serpentine, and I'll tell you more about that later, we then played it with our audiences, and after that we brought it with the More Than Human Rights project to COP16 for biodiversity, where it was played by policymakers who attended the Entertainment and Culture Pavilion. So the idea is also to try and get those tendrils out of the cultural space and into the spaces of decision making, of course. I will skip through Back to Earth very quickly to just tell you that to celebrate our 50th anniversary at Serpentine, we decided to invite 50 artists to propose artworks that were also environmental campaigns or initiatives. And this image is just supposed to show you that the breadth of what artists came up with gave us the very clear sense that what we think art does in relation and in encountering the planet is a very, very small glimpse into the breadth of the imagination of where artistic research ends up. So fast forward several years, in 2024, I mean 23 really, but we managed to sort of promote the General Ecology Project to a department, which I chose to call Ecologies, also so that it wouldn't have this kind of very authored curatorial project. Ecologies is now follows a strategy which I worked on for most of 23, which is a strategy that looks at embedding environmental action or themes or decision-making processes throughout all of the protocols of the organization, based on a principle of, rather than make a blanket decision on emissions, for example, or on calculations or on materials, what we do is we work with it's a department, but it also works with every other department and area of activity to make sure that we empower that department or area of activity of doing what it does best, but doing it with environmental justice and balance in mind. It's a slog, it's a struggle, and if I wanted to get myself out of the kinds of institutional frustrations that have been plaguing me my whole life, I certainly dug myself far deeper into them instead of out of them. But so I describe Ecologies as a holistic, artist-led, systems focus and adaptive approach. We follow a principle of open research, that is to say that whatever we do internally, we also somehow try and do it externally, or at least with a kind of relatively porous boundary between the two. Organizational prototyping, we try different ways of being, say, biomimetic or imitating the way that nature works within the organization on some initiatives or work streams. We also try and focus on work culture. So one of the programs that I'm most excited about is actually workshops that artists come and develop with and for Serpentine, our colleagues. And that is so that the internal culture of the organization is, doesn't think of ecology as sustainability, but think of ecology as ecologies. And then we, have a very vast and long-standing network of collaborators. And then we're hoping, and this is a sort of future, to look at evaluation and how we actually evaluate impact and things like this in such a way that it's more adherent to the the strengths and the visions that art can have. So this is maybe one for a screenshot because I won't pause on it very much. But in essence, what I've found over the course of this research is that depending on what you think art can do in the space of ecology or environmental justice or balance, you might need to change your institutional or organizational functioning to be something different. So the space that holds a certain kind of action or a certain kind of aim has to learn how to self-transform as well. This Sun and Sea I will not say very much on. It's an opera performance that was presented in Venice, as Stephen said. And the reason why I put it here is that over the course of its touring throughout the world, it has picked up different issues of environmental justice that pertain to the place itself and sort of peppered them into things like the libretto of the opera or certain visual cues or elements of the opera itself. So whilst the artwork doesn't fully change, it takes into consideration the way that it itself transforms as the world transforms. And then finally, Sites of Practice, which is a micro-funding experiment that looks at supporting small organizations that are kind of art or design led and that are doing work on and with land use or land repair or land pedagogy. And that if you want to read about it, that Sites of Practice work, which I'm hoping will continue over the next years, is somewhat described in the Stanford Social Innovation Review in a small text, which puts it in context with the larger initiative by our funders, Arising Quo, of, let's say, seeding transformational change in a way that funders don't do. And I have a whole other interest in transforming philanthropy, but we will get there another time. Now comes the sad part, or the other part. And I will read from it in the 20 minutes that are left. So in the tarot, the most frequent and undisputed interpretation of Arcana 13 is not death but it's transformation. Not that there's ever been much of a difference between the two. Winter comes and the landscape itself prepares to die. When we look at animals and plants, we often witness a kind of preparation upon the changing of the seasons, an evolutionary dance between weather and choice, where the very first hints of transformation prompt a withdrawal of nutrients from leaves, the springing up of shoots and buds, the storing of foods and fats, the building of burrows and nest. In the face of transformation, our more than human companions may not know what lies ahead, but they sure know how to prepare for it. Deciduous trees, whose connection between leaves and branches is ensured by a small system of tubules that transport nutrients and water to its extremities, sever that connection in autumn, first by draining the leaves of chlorophyll and later by closing off the tubules, and in doing so, the leaves fall in the autumn bluster. This kind of preparation can sometimes be peculiar and endearing, like in the work of acorn woodpeckers, who create thousands of little holes in trees and fill each one with a single acorn. Or it can be gruesome, moles that bite earthworms and inject them with a toxic substance that keeps them alive and paralyzed throughout the winter. A kind of hell that only someone the likes of Cormac McCarthy could possibly have imagined it. Of course, in cyclical time, death also heralds the possibility of renewal. There is no finality in an end, only a transition to something else or a return to a vaster whole. Anthropologist Ernesto de Martino spent much of his career witnessing and interpreting ends of worlds. De Martino was focused on the Italian South, that slow and glorious place of heat, faith, and decay. For him, the end of a world happens when the very cultural assets, the very cultural ethos that conditions and supports it collapses. So a loss of meaning as an intersubjective architecture, as the underlying structure that holds our sense of the world in place. And here's a postcard from Argentina from March 23. The director of the Museum of History and Anthropology of Rosario, Pablo Montini, speaks with knowledge and conviction. There is so much to tell because the history of the continent has been erased, from colonial terraforming to the displacement, genocide, and extinction of original peoples, landscapes, and ways of knowing, as well as stories of sacred beings. Most of the material in the museum comes from the Andes further north, where the wealth was concentrated. And we see examples of what's sometimes referred to, or at least the Getty refers to it as colonial art, arte colonial, Christian-themed imagery from the 16th and 17th century, created by local artists and craftspeople to imitate or emulate European iconography upon the order of local colonial and missionary powers. Montini points at the Christian saints' auras Their colors, he says, do you see their colors? Compelled to worship and depict the likeness of foreign deities, indigenous artists hid local pigments, fundamental to sacred rites, in the images. Local seeds and animals appear in the patterns of gowns and curtains. Mountains give new and syncretic Madonnas their peculiar triangular shapes. Like the woodpecker hiding an acorn in each hole of a tree, glimpses and echoes of a world at the brink of extinction are woven into the visual patterns of syncretic objects. Then in 2023, I picked up, at the behest of my friend Harold in Vienna, a philosopher, ecologist, nihilist, optimist, turned organizational mentor, a book called Hospicing Modernity, Facing Humanity's Wrongs and the Implications for Social Activism. By the time I began to read it, this book was already quietly but steadily making its way through the circles of social practitioners working between activism, organizational theory, and technology. People spoke about it in hushed tones, spoke about its teaching and what it managed to say about what it feels like to be alive and try to do something worthwhile in the midst of all this mess. Now, I've always been profoundly convinced that a cultural artifact, be it a book, an artwork, a poem, a story, a film, whatever, is all the more incisive upon its present, the more it recognizes, touches, and perhaps even releases something that is already there, stuck at the back of your throat, not knowing how to come out, lest the whole structure of the present should collapse around it. Vanessa Machado de Oliveira Andreotti, the author of Hospicing Modernity, described it as a compendium of medicines, exercises, and tools to allow colonial modernity to die around us, but perhaps much more crucially inside of us, and to do so with what she terms humility, discernment, and grace. Andreotti recommends learning from the palliative care movement. Hospicing, she described, is about developing our capacity to stomach what's difficult and nauseating without throwing up, throwing a tantrum, or throwing in the towel. It's about staying with this death, approaching death and relating to this death very differently, the death of our system and our own death, in order to be able to live well. The stakes are high. Modernity has caused a profound civilizational cognitive impairment in Western and in general dominant culture, one that makes it impossible to understand the human as a piece in a far vaster metabolic planetary weave of connections. And this cognitive incapacity is putting the entire life support system of the Earth in jeopardy. De Martino agrees, at least on the cognitive aspects of this particular contemporary end of the world. The insidious Western apocalypse, he suggests, is characterized by the loss of sense and of domesticity in the world, the failure of intersubjective human relations, the ominous shrinking of any horizon whatsoever of a future that is practicable in a communitarian way according to human liberty and dignity. In other words, the atomization of individual consciousness and shutting away from the wider planetary mind are eroding the possibility of an experience of being that is developed in community among more than human and human relations. For years, and definitely since working at the intersection of culture and the ecological, I have been trying to put words around the intuition that metaphors don't exist. In Food of the Gods, the prophetic philosopher and psychedelics evangelist Terence McKenna suggests that all life is communication. Quote, "The evidence gathered from millennia of shamanic experience argues that the world is actually made of language in some fashion. For the shaman, the cosmos is a tale that becomes true as it is told and as it tells itself. This is why the shaman is the remote ancestor of the poet and the artist." Plant communication, plant use, plant medicine use is an example of a complex language of chemical and social interactions. Yet most of us are unaware, this is McKenna continues, most of us are unaware of the effects of plants on ourselves and our reality, partly because we have forgotten that plants have always mediated the human cultural relationship to the world at large. So perhaps To imagine that metaphors don't exist is not to deny that the earth is in infinite and perennial communication with and within itself and the wider cosmic ecosystems, and that cultural forms and communal organizations of humans and more than humans depend on this endless stream. Rather, it is more like suggesting that the distance of symbol, word, or symbolic system from the wider metabolism out of which it emerges is a fiction imposed by modernity that underholds the fiction that humans, certain humans at the very least, can survive alone, far from all relations. Too often today do we clamorously mistake arguing over the different possible meanings of a particular term for entering into relation with the world. Signifiers float about, tethered to nothing. And before we know it, we're floating about too, alienated and poisoned in desperate, angry loneliness. And here we get again to the passage you read. This, I wonder, may be what the end of a world feels like when it is happening in real time. A progressive loss of meaning, a drive towards acceleration and annihilation, an acceptance of unspeakable horror as though it were ordinary. We call it the polycrisis and speak of it as though it were separate from us, as though it weren't everywhere, including inside of ourselves. From this point of view, then, it may be appropriate to stop trying to articulate solutions too quickly and to start in the first instance to exercise our capacity to hold, bear witness to, remember, and navigate this great churning. What questions can we ask of a world that's ending? What rituals may help us hold and weather change? What embers do we already hold of what has been? How to make space for what we may never experience? And here we may catch a glimpse of how we may come to understand art and its responsibility, agency, and potential. Because it could be that it's, if done responsibly, the space of a story or an artwork or a cultural space may be that space where complexity, ambiguity, discomfort, fear, and denial can be held with tenderness. The first task of culture may simply be to notice, to stay. Terence McKenna again, if the ego is not regularly and repeatedly dissolved in the unbounded hyperspace of the transcendent other, there will always be slow drift away from the sense of self as part of nature's larger whole. In the spring of 2024, my frequent collaborator, writer and curator Filipa Ramos and I put together a small exhibition in Vienna for the first Climate Biennale called Songs for the Changing Seasons. Songs was an experiment in trying to stay. It asked about art as forms of tuning into a world that's changing irremediably. Art as a place where we let go of what will be lost and find a cognitive capacity to grieve it. Art as a place where we store that which we hope will live through the great interregnum and into the next. We faced a challenge. How do we hold space for that which may need to be faced without immediately trying to fix it? Can there be possible positions for ecological cultures today that refuse to lean on either information transmission or prototyping solutions? And perhaps more importantly, what is lost in the nuance of space, in the differential and differentially distributed real life instantiations of this current end of this current world, when the only options available to us seem to be hope or nihilistic hopelessness. On the day the exhibition opened, the only word we could find for any of it was tenderness. And although the imminent falling of the sky has been forewarned time and time again, the easiest thing is always to look away. This is where the authors of the Dark Mountain Manifesto recommend making the unspeakable spoken and calling where we are what it is. Quote, "We believe that in an age of ecocide, the last taboo must be broken and that only artists can do it." In 2023, when I visited Adrián Villarrojas in his studio in Rosario, the artists and the studios were closing down the infrastructure that had allowed for the presentation of an exhibition in Australia, which was made by creating digital worlds then populated by creatures, objects, monuments, landscapes, and materials, and then running time really quickly through and allowing for time and catastrophe to sort of mold and melt the material, and then extracting from that digital space those digital objects and creating them in real life. At the same time, the wetlands ecosystems near Rosario burned with a wrath of anthropogenic fires ignited to destroy protected ecosystems and their multi-species communities in order to make space for more cattle infrastructure. Villarrojas and his studio stretched, melted, burned materials, their gargantuan geological actions of deep time on the planet being recreated at lightning speed inside the studio. As the works were being created, he tells me, smoke from the fires was everywhere, and wet towels had to be placed across windowsills and door frames. Briefly, I found myself wondering whether particles from this particular catastrophe may have ended up in Sydney with the exhibition, fused into the sculptures themselves, echoes of digital catastrophes. Well, the sculptures are echoes of digital catastrophes. The imaginal world and the physical world are but two stages in perhaps the same metabolic process. In Vienna, Philippa and I chose the word songs. This is again Sydney. In Vienna, Philippa and I chose the word songs rather than say gestures. Almost unintentionally, it brought with it cultures of offering, of gifting, and of ritual and the sacred. It brought back the communicative possibilities that we may recognize in the world at large as the mothers of human language and symbol. Hasn't it been suggested, after all, that human speech was born from witnessing birdsong? The exhibition proposed that collective art and culture still holds, in the best of cases, the inherent capability to be the supportive tissue for a deep time, long-term, more than human exchange of meanings, of gifts, of songs. The logic of planetary interconnection creates temporary thickenings and loosenings of its constitutive elements. This is true of bodies, of humans, or of water, or of anything. It's true of ideas, concepts, and cultural forms. Life, matter, and meaning organize themselves into temporary architectures, or mortal forms, or architectures of meaning. And as they do, they immediately set up the condition of possibility of their loosening again, dissolving back into their constitutive whole. Our mortality, for instance, that are akin, our thoughts, cultural forms. In the face of the inevitability of dissolution, art and culture can midwife this loosening, holding space for the unavoidable cycle of endings and beginnings. It may do so by learning from palliative care tools, as Vanessa Andreotti suggests, or at least consciously making itself aware that we are in a moment that may require some palliative care. Of the palliative work that needs to happen internally as modernity loosens its grip on the world, Andreotti writes, quote, "Allow what is agonizing within you to die without trying to rescue the old state and its sensation of familiarity, coherence, and stability. Remember that the wider metabolism needs the space being cleared by the death of the old in order to strengthen its tether to you. At the ends of worlds, culture holds the memory of ancient forms, supporting the survivance, feeble as their signals may sometimes be, of ways of knowing, ways of being, worlds that once were. In my opinion, the space of culture today sits, or could sit, somewhere at the meeting point of palliative care for the end of a world, with all its memory-making functions, the development of tools for planetary belonging, with all its connecting and ego-dissolving functions, and the exploration of the possibility of alternatives, with all its imaginary and imaginal functions. And in midwifing many ends, art may also birth bring birth to or make space for beginnings, a re-anchoring of meaning to the material world, repairing the severed connections between symbol and ontology, re-thickening the world again, stitching the fabric back together, gathering and reconfiguring the pieces in instances of devotion or renewal. There is a term cited by Dougald Hine in At Home in the Ruins from a writer with experience working in an intensive care unit that he quotes as engaged surrender. In time, I learned that while one cannot always control what is to come, one could at the very least bear witness to it with truth and hopefully again wisdom and discernment. So beyond the affects of doomsday nihilism or solutionist optimism, can we turn directly towards the present, face it, and start to act in response to what may emerge when we finally do? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lucia. So we do have a few minutes, and I've written, please enter questions, comments. There is one, and it is, what is your dream for how art might be shown, experienced, and culturally embedded in the future in a way that honors art as ecological?
Wow, it's a big one. If I had like a really specific shape and a dream, I would tell you right away. I think what I would like to see certainly is, okay, speaking from the point of view of how art might be shown, right? So speaking of cultural spaces, what I would love to see is for cultural spaces to stop reacting to so-called urgencies of lack of funding or the need to prove footfall and so on, and which inevitably leads them to quite populist choices, actually, and start to actually attending to a vision of self-transformation, fragility in a sense, putting our vulnerability and actually change and transform in relation to a kind of longer term vision that perhaps even exceeds one cycle of directorship or generation of people and so on. And if that sounds really abstract, that's because it is. I found over time that this work, I mean, this is kind of why I've spent a decade and a bit at Serpentine. This work becomes all the deeper the more one knows the inner workings of the organization. So as your frustration rises, you're kind of embedding your kind of capacity to understand what the loop of possible changes are also changes. However, I think that at the same time, the space of culture is being threatened by increasingly authoritarian governmental regimes and also by the interest groups that hold so much financial power of advanced technologies. And as a result of that, I think there is a little bit of a labor of love and care that we also owe to art and to culture itself. Mm-hmm. And so in the first instance, I think my dream for how art might be shown is for it to be shown and actually not to collapse into the kind of ideology apparatus of whoever's most powerful at a particular moment. Mm. And that would be a good step enough. That would be a good place to start.
So a follow-up from Olga. Do your projects also showcase artists organizing, acting and participating in social organizations related to climate activism and ecology?
Yes, in part it does. And Back to Earth showed a bit of a breadth of action. What was really interesting about the Back to Earth project at Serpentine is that some artists came up with, we actually divided it into four. I didn't show you this, but we divided it into four kind of vectors of how the projects that we received or that we worked on functioned. And those vectors are quite interesting. One of them was kind of publics. So the aim of those particular artworks or campaigns was to raise either public awareness or to mobilize the public, which tend to be a little bit closer to artists organizing and participating in social organizations for climate activism. Then there was places, speculations, and systems. Some of them were kind of activist, but more engaging themselves with things like changing the food system or changing education or changing kind of different policy infrastructures and things like this. Places was artists who, like Tabitha Rezer, for example, said, well, look, I don't know if this is an artwork, but at the same time as I'm doing my art thing, I'm also looking after this place in the rainforest of French Guiana to kind of archive and disseminate Afro-Brazilian, Afro-Amazonian cultures and knowledge of astronomy, death and birth doula, and agroecology. And I would love for that place to receive some support. And we, transformed in order to be adherent to the needs of that endeavor without sort of plonking ourselves there or trying to take Hamakaba, the center, to the Serpentine or anything like that. So the answer is yes, but it is true that a lot of organizations and curators, I think, are focusing a lot more on, let's say, direct and declarative activism and advocacy than I have. I think it's just, I was once in a conversation with an ex actually, where it was like, you're the activist and I'm the diplomat. It's sort of like, I don't, it's just where I gravitate to, where my brain goes, but it's not to say that I think that there's one way of doing it and not another. In fact, I'm trying to say the exact opposite, that whatever the shape of your interaction with that, if you make yourself conscious that you're sitting on the planet and want to do something in relation to that, then go for it. Well, then go for it. Then the
So
system should be able to
follow
support
up
you.
actually to that. So within Serpentine, has there actually been any change in terms of infrastructure and thinking based upon what you're doing? Obviously, Hans Ulrich is devoted to this thinking, but has there been change at Serpentine?
There has been a lot of change. I mean, the fact that we've managed to, so few examples, the fact that there is an ecologies department and hopefully will survive what's happening to funding for the arts today in the UK, the fact that the principles of environmental justice and balance and also more than human relationality have made it into our environmental policies. So the policy is suddenly not just sustainability and so on. And it's like, it's nice papers to have, but I think after a few generations of documents, that stuff becomes, moves away from the kind of quirky, weird stuff that Lucia wanted to put in there and more towards a sense of the organization itself. Having said that, and this is where it would be very useful for me to be able to know who is listening, because, some things you can share more widely and not. What I would say is that these endeavors, no matter how structural you try and embed them, and that was really, the resilience of it was part of the point, will always end up being the nice to haves when it comes to the crunch. So if suddenly there is a huge contraction in budgets, then only if you have real executive buy-in and willingness to take certain risks, is a project like this able to survive at the same kind of level or even to grow and thrive. And that goes through seasons, just like everything else does.
So
And also, it's much harder than I make it sound. I mean, really, like I love this whole. When I often come back to Serpentine, I'm like, you have no idea how much work I do on your behalf. Like, I really make it sound like it was this completely kind of visionary institutional transformation. The good thing about Serpentine is it's good at incubating stuff by sort of letting it happen without spending too much time kind of thinking about it. And that's how this came up. But it's been a hassle, and there's still not just a hassle, it's been a struggle and a hustle more than and it still isn't, it's up there at the top of the whole organizational primary mission and strategy. And sometimes you still have to remind people, yes, but yeah, like let's remind ourselves that this is part of the top of the, we put it there, so what are we going to do? So it's not, I will never say that it's easy.
So we're running a little bit over. There's another question. Thank you for a hope-filled presentation. Your instigation of institutional eco-transformation of Serpentine is a heroic work of art in itself. Let's see. Sorry. Scale issues make displaying the work quite challenging. What are your thoughts on making it possible to visualize, experience that?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I don't know. I think I might just not be able to answer that quickly enough to be able to address the other two, which I think are really important as well. It's a really good question, but I think an exhibition curator or someone who works on collections and trying to sort of memorialize certain works that happen in the environment would be able to speak to them better.
Okay.
So how do I make accessible to artists? I mean, you can write to me online. I think my limitation is really my time. There's no one that does the answering of my emails on my behalf. So if I miss it, it's just because I receive so much. Um, on the notion of the ecological approach being imposed from the, let's say, global north or northwest, I completely agree. And in a certain sense, I mean, I completely agree. And I just so happen to be in this incredibly strange position of being on the screen while I can't see you. But the only thing that I would say is just to absolutely echo the question, to say that the question that for me, it's very important that we remind institutions that we're talking about environmental justice and balance and not sustainability, and that this is a bit of the work that we've been trying to push. And to kind of always start from those initial kind of assumptions, and to always remind our stakeholders and our kind of the people that we work with about those assumptions. And you'd be surprised, like even after 2 hours of talking about environmental justice, someone goes, yes, but the use of materials, which is super important. But I suppose there's like a spectrum of agendas. And whether it's a means for absolution of institutions that are complicit in it, yes. Yes.
Art washing.
Art washing, like greenwashing, like everything, like 100%.
So that seems to be the range of questions. So thanks, Lucia. We'll continue the conversation with the students, and thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you. Thank you.